40 Days and 40 Nights by Keegan Wildman Wendell. Chapter 3, the 24th of Nisan, High School Charisma and Drug Reform. The night passed with ease. The sun came up and I said my morning prayer. I prayed for the Lord Yahshua to teach me his ways, for his will to be done. I got up and did my warm-up routine, wrote a chapter and edited the previous one, memorized the next part of the Bible I needed, the next portion of Genesis chapter 2. I was sitting there at my folding table under the canopy for what seemed like hours, staring into space with my abundance of books flapping in the breeze, and Hebrew calendar nailed to an upright sheet of plywood. Then around the afternoon I decided to take a bike ride around the lake. The lake is inside the campground common area, and the road winded its way in an oval shape around it. There are signs scattered all around its edges that warn the campers not to swim because you might get eaten. I put on some music in my earbuds for the ride around. Yahshua is the greatest gift to all humanity, and the second greatest is, in my humble opinion, the gift of music. I had plenty of listening material to last a while in my phone, and I selected an album by a couple of autistic boys from Norway, Mats and Morgan, with their album Rubber Road. They entered the limelight shortly after being recognized on some European TV network show in the early 80s. They had performed Zappa's piece King Kong. Fasting is going to take a toll on my energy levels in the coming days, and it's important that I remain sharp. I did countless laps around the lake on the paved, not rubber road. I rejoice in all the creation of Yahweh in moments like these. The music literally takes me to heaven in my mind's eye. The shalom is there. Campers were sitting outside their RVs. Some were grilling, others reading, and a few were in groups in their fold-up chairs talking, motioning with their hands, smiling, and laughing. It was a gorgeous day. The laps were maybe a quarter mile in circumference. Halfway through the Rubber Road album, I was done. Now look up the duration of the album and tell me how many laps I did if I was traveling at an average of 8 miles per hour. I'll wait. The brief bicycle expedition was completed, and I began practicing my music, starting with vocal warm-ups, and then I sang a few songs. And suddenly I felt a need to compose another song. I have many hours of original music that have been recorded. Some of it lost to time. My dad, Kevin, had always been a constant encouragement in my pursuit of music creation. After he found out that I had been making music on the family computer as a young boy, he brought home a new piece of software that had just come out. It was called Acid Pro. This software allowed you to fumble around with samples and loops. It was a slight step beyond what I was used to, which was a software called Cakewalk, the first edition from the early 90s or so. With Cakewalk, there is a virtual musical staff and a massive selection of instruments, pianos, horns, strings, drums, to name a few. The sounds are a bit goofy and artificial, but give the composer an audible idea of what their arrangements would sound like if they were to be played by real musicians. I was a young guy shuffling notes about the staff on this software, and this was my entry-level experience as a composer, even though I had no idea what a composer was at that time. It was just like picking up paint, mixing various colors on a canvas in a carefree exuberance, but with digital sound. The software gave me the ability to arrange notes for any instrument I wanted. The individual instruments had their own staffs. I was not savvy at music theory during this time, and I pretty much Christmas treed notes onto their respective staffs, selecting 8th notes or 16th or whatever, and accent marks and tempos at random. If it sounded good to me, it was good. Acid Pro, as I said, was the next step up in my self-motivated compositional education. This software had an actual organic sound recordings or samples and drum beats and loops that you could layer and fade out and fade in and isolate and shift. I used my meager knowledge and experience with Cakewalk and built it up from there. I also uploaded my own sample at one point. It was taken from a skipping CD from a band called Switchfoot. The song was called Underwater. I took the first 4 seconds of the song with the skips and everything included and added layers of weirdness, and my neighborhood friend Will and I kind of rapped over it. But really, we were just being eccentric and comically self-indulgent. It really could have been a unique genre of its own if we kept at it. When I was around 13, my dad got me an acoustic guitar, an Alvarez, and I received classical training from my tutor in his rental duplex off Northwood, in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. His name, I recall, is Jim Breen. He was a bachelor living with a few cats at the time. I wasn't very talkative with my teacher. I had been homeschooled since 2nd grade. For me, Jim was kind of a stranger for the years I was under his tutelage, but I think that's mainly because I was just a weird student. One night, my dad brought me to my lesson, and after the lesson was finished and we packed and were outside, We were saying our farewells to Mr. Jim Breen, and I noticed a $20 bill sitting by his doorstep. I picked it up and inquired of my dad and Mr. Breen, asking them who was the owner. An awkward ordeal between my dad and my guitar teacher ensued. "I think it's mine, Keeg." "Mr. Wendell? That would be my $20. I'm pretty sure I dropped it when one of my students came here before you." I was sorry I brought it up. My dad wasn't particularly great at handling these kind of situations. In the latter days of his life, around 2014 or so, I learned that he was a bit autistic. He informed me out of the blue as if it had just come to him. I think he must have diagnosed it himself, and maybe I was the one to help him reach that personal conclusion. In high school, a friend of mine, Tony, had Asperger's syndrome. When we became good friends, I began to understand some of his quirks, and they reminded me in some way of my dad, but I didn't know how to explain it well. One night, after arguing with my dad, Kevin, I gave up and I told him that he reminded me of Tony. "You're just like Tony, Dad." Whatever it was a characteristic trait that struck me as a bit odd. The characteristic strengths my mother and dad possessed were at odds with one another, and also their differences and mental deficiencies were extraordinarily incompatible. To put it another way, God had blessed me with some truly unique parents. They were incredibly smart, but also in some ways emotionally and mentally challenged. My mother was born in 1951. She was the youngest of 7 with 2 sisters and 4 brothers. My grandmother, her mother, was emotionally and physically abusive toward my mother, and my mom grew up in a chaotic household and neighborhood in Queens, New York. My dad told me, after she had died, that as a child she once picked up a cat by its tail and swung it around her head, like the audiences at a rap show will spin their t-shirts over their heads. She swung this poor creature around and threw it against a wall with utter hatred and disgust. Growing up with her was a challenge to say the least. She would be sweet sometimes, and so kind and loving, but it was hard to know when she would turn into a complete psychopath. Every day I would hear her screaming at the top of her lungs. This was demonic oppression, and our family was under the curse. I'm not saying that my life was completely horrific. There were a lot of nice things to look back on, but after she died, I was a bit relieved, and I also felt guilty for feeling that way about it for a long time afterward. Although my dad was, as I said, a bit autistic and introverted, and had a hard time relating to other people in a typical fashion, he was a savant. He started a business with my uncle, his younger brother, Gary, in the mid-'80s. It was called Online PC Service Incorporated. My dad was the vice president, and he was in charge of sales, and my uncle Gary was the president. He was the brains behind the operation. They fixed computers, printers, keyboards, fax machines, and the like. By the time the 90s arrived, my dad had won many accounts for the company and was solely responsible for securing continued business relationships and a constant revenue flow. Anything my dad touched would turn to gold. He was a gifted writer, salesman, and comedian. This exchange between my dad and my guitar teacher was just another one of the many bittersweet moments where I caught a glimpse of the emotional ineptitude of my dad and his inability to relate well with other adults. We got in the car and he cursed under his breath and said, "He took my $20. Psh, I know that was my money." I was homeschooled from 2nd grade onward. Every day I became more stir-crazy from lack of any social life, and at the age of 16, I asked my parents if I could attend public school, because I was overloaded with cabin fever. They obliged and I began freshman year in Royal Palm Beach High School. I signed up for jazz ensemble to play electric guitar. I brought the charts that were assigned to me in jazz ensemble to my classical guitar teacher, Mr. Jim Breen, and he mentored me into the traditions of jazz guitar rhythm and lead technique. The camaraderie amongst the rhythm section crew in the jazz band helped me to excel in rudimentary jazz and performance, and helped me to perform in any style with any group of musicians from high school onward. The next Christmas, my dad got me a 4-track Tascam tape recorder. This was yet another step up from my previous experiences in composition. The recorder was more of a hands-on learning tool than the software I had become familiar with, and there was a slightly different learning curve. The knobs and the inputs and the outputs and various parameters and settings were foreign to me, but I was fascinated. It was interesting recording directly into a physical medium. The cassettes I used weren't the standard 2-track stereo cassettes that you can buy anywhere. They were special tapes that had 4 tracks, and I could record and direct signal into one or all of the 4 channels and place them anywhere within the spectrum of the stereophonic field. In sophomore year, I had selected art class with Mr. Jeff McKinley. He was an aging hippie that was talented at befriending lumbering teenagers like myself. McKinley noticed that I played guitar. It would be hard not to. I brought my guitar around everywhere, but he had an unprecedented idea for me. I couldn't draw or paint all that well, so he suggested that I bring in my Tascam and record some music, and he would grade my recordings as art toward the class. Pretty soon, I was getting my musically inclined friends to come jam out with me and Mr. McKinley and record music. We started a group during art class, period 2. Then McKinley had us meet after school as an extracurricular project. We cleared out the classroom storage closet and brought in a drum kit, and amps, and a keyboard, and a bass, and guitars, microphones, and an 8-track Tascam tape recorder, and it was on. At Royal Palm High, there were days where the other classes I attended would have nothing going on save a movie and idle chatter amongst the students. On these days, I asked and was allowed a hall pass to go to Mr. McKinley's for the remainder of the hour, or often 2. There, I would work on music in our art room recording studio that used to be a storage closet. It was decently sized. You could comfortably fit perhaps 10 people in there. I had recordings of these sessions, but alas, there are among some of those that I mentioned that were lost to time. In 2019, Mr. McKinley had passed away earlier that year, and out of all the students he amassed over 3 decades, I was the first to find out. We were all connected on Facebook, and he was active on all our pages. I happened to be up early, and I saw that one of his cousins tagged him in an old family reunion photo with the somber news of his departing. I compiled from our Royal Palm Beach High School art class studio recordings some of the surviving sessions onto an album that I had manufactured with new artwork and a blurb about Mr. McKinley. I was shipped 100 copies. This was my first professional-looking hard copy release. I had made many albums before, and in high school I was known to burn them onto CDs and pass them around to anyone who cared to listen to them. A few months after Mr. McKinley died in 2019, I had these professional-grade CDs in their fine packaging that I designed myself, resplendent with its nice artwork and a spicy invalid logo, and a blurb about my hippie art teacher, and all the luxury of professionalism. I destroyed them. I was convicted that my high school foolishness was all too blasphemous and was a grievance to Yahweh, and I wanted to do away with all of it. The album had a super wicked title, some songs had cursing, and others were just downright evil. I stacked the CDs into a knee-high tower and smashed them with a 50-pound kettle weight. The video recording is yet to be uploaded onto my YouTube channel. There are some that remain floating around somewhere, as I gave a few friends and people far and away a copy. I sent messages to people to destroy them, but I'm doubtful they did. I just pray that the Lord Yeshua will turn this evil I once created into an opportunity to bring someone closer to Him, that He will turn the wickedness of my past into the glory of our future. At a picnic table in the campground, I began fashioning some melodies on my new travel MIDI keyboard. I worked for hours on end, praying that the Lord would accept this labor as a pleasing aroma. I didn't know what the song would be about, and I was struggling to get it down. This idea of failing and trying and failing and pursuing reminded me somehow of Jacob, and how he wouldn't let the messenger of Adonai go until he blessed him. So after getting this simple idea down, I titled the track Wrestling with the Master of the Universe, because I felt like the Holy Spirit wanted me to do something else with my time, and at the moment I was struggling and delaying something that He needed me to accomplish for the day. A lady came up to me with a serious camera in her hand. It looked way too intimidating for someone with my limited experience in photography. "Can I take a picture of your drum set?" The drums were a pretty unique landmark under the canopy for the campground. I was right in the front near the entrance, and many people would gape over at me. I asked her if she would like me to play it while she took some pictures. She loved that idea. So I sat on the stool and banged out some beats. She was impressed with the lack of sound. The silent stroke drum kit was a good idea to bring to the site. Nobody could complain about any noise pollution coming from my tent. She went all around and snapped the pics. Then I spoke with her for a few. I asked her if I could see the pics. She showed me and asked me if I would like her to email them to me. Wow, that would be great. I scrambled to find a pen to write down my address, but her husband was already prepared and gave me a couple of her business cards. Colleen Cowles, writing and photography, one read. Her husband proudly explained that she wrote a book, and the second card had the book title and the details. It was a book about the war on drugs and how we are all being enslaved in some aspect or another as a result of inefficient policies and corporate greed in the war on drugs. I glanced at the card introspectively. My dad, Kevin, was a strong proponent for drug reform. He read all the books about it, how they changed their policies in Canada and Portugal to astounding results. He even delivered a motivational speech at one of our Toastmaster meetings. It was a hot-button issue for him. My new companions and I were carried away. After a few moments of discussing drug reform and popular books on the topic, such as Chasing the Scream, I inevitably shared the gospel with them. They smiled, and I think they knew I was onto something, but weren't sure what. I prayed for them and bid them adieu. A few minutes later, I was sitting at my folding table under my canopy, and I heard a van idling outside. I ducked my head to look out. There was a couple. A bearded, long-haired hippie man sat at the wheel of a Sprinter van with his hippie wife. "When are you going to play?" I stumbled out of the canopy like a vaudeville comedian, and they laughed. "Oh, I've been playing. I'm just resting at the moment." "Sorry." "Not a problem. Where are y'all heading?" "Yeah, we're gonna ride around the loop, then we're heading up to northern Florida for a bluegrass festival. They're calling it String Break." I laughed at the pun and explained how awesome that sounded. The wife smiled. "It's for a charity. They have a music camp for partially deaf kids. They teach them all about music." I squealed an astonished stream of joy and catharsis over this new information. The conversation went on for an uncertain length of time where we discussed our mutual appreciation over the art of music. We shared anecdotes about music festivals like Bonnaroo and who we saw and what we love, and we went on to discuss organic food and nutrition, another passion of mine. The wife shared her frustration of not being able to find healthy snacks and victuals when you were on the road. That wasn't going to be a problem for me. The only thing I need to worry about is finding water, and as far as I can tell, it's all organic. They had a decal supporting some politician in Massachusetts, Dr. Shiva, I believe. He was trying to make a difference on the health food front over there in Mass. A boy abruptly began chattering in the back. "Who is that?" "That's our son." "He's not deaf, is he?" They both laughed. "No, he's just trying to join in on the conversation." Before they even knew what was happening, I laid down the law of Yeshua and implanted the gospel into the joyful and fertile soil of their hearts, explaining the book of Genesis in a way I am positive they have never heard it explained before. I sent them off with a prayer of blessing and traveling mercies, an encounter with the Holy Ghost they will never forget, that I am positive will save their lives someday. They were appreciatives. I shook their hands, and they headed off. I wrote their names in my prayer book, Jamie and Michelle from Massachusetts. I spent the rest of my evening in prayer and read some of the book of Daniel, starting from chapter 1 to 3. "Now if ye be ready at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto you, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Daniel 3:15-18. If I give into hunger over the next 36 days, it would be as serious to me as bowing down to a pagan god. I was exhausted and beyond famished. It had been 4 days of no food and only water. I prayed for the Lord Yeshua to cover me in the campground with his precious blood, and then I draped my head over my pillow and slept.